Archiving Eden. This conversation is a part of the series of public lectures and discussions organized by Science Gallery Bengaluru for its first digital pop-up exhibition, PHYTOPIA. For PHYTOPIA, we hope to bring together engineers, scientists, designers, artists, and biohackers to create an experience where visitors can explore and experiment beyond the kitchen, the lab, and the farm. This program is organized in collaboration with Bangalore International Center. A warm welcome to today's speakers, Dornith Doherty and Giovanni Aloi. Dornith Doherty is an American artist working primarily with photography, video, and scientific imaging. She currently resides in South Lake and is Distinguished Research Professor at the University of North Texas. Her work, Archiving Eden, is being shown at Science Gallery Bengaluru as a part of PHYTOPIA. You can know more about this project in the exhibition section of our website. Giovanni Aloi is an author, curator who teaches modern and contemporary art at the School of Art Institute of Chicago and Sotheby's Institute of Art. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of Antenna, the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture. Science Gallery Bengaluru is featuring 2 issues of Antenna. You can find Beyond Morphology and Why Look at Plants on our website along with other reading material. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we begin, I would like to remind our audience that Dornith will be present for a Q&A session after this conversation at 7:30 p.m. You may post your questions in the chat box and we will pass them on to the speakers. New research in science shows us that plants are collaborative, sentient, and communicative beings. It displaces the anthropocentric position of plants as stationary and mute organisms. Dornith, it would be great if you could begin by giving us some background about your work in documenting seed banks around the world and the massive efforts undertaken by biologists and conservation agencies to protect biodiversity.
Thank you. First of all, thanks to everybody at the Science Gallery for inviting me to present this talk, but also participate in the exhibition. It's a really important point of view on plants and plant life, and I think that it's going to be really fun to see all the other artists that are involved. And thanks very much also to Giovanni for agreeing to participate in a conversation. I've been reading his book, Why Look at Plants, and I've really enjoyed it. And I think that there's a lot of things for us to talk about between my project and his extensive publication record with a 10A, which I think is a wonderful journal. Here you go. So in 2008, I read about the pending completion of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, located on an island only 600 miles from the North Pole. This remote and secure seed bank is buried deep inside a mountain so tall that if both polar ice caps melt, the collection of seeds will remain safe. So when I read that a modern day Noah's Ark had been built there, I immediately wanted to photograph it. I was inspired by the kind of simultaneously optimistic and pessimistic aspects of building the first truly global botanical backup collection. On one hand, you have volunteers and scientists who have dedicated themselves to creating this very important archive. And on the other side, the gravity of climate change and political instability has created this need for a really remote and secure, almost doomsday vault. So I didn't start with Svalbard. I started at local seed banks and worked for a couple of years before I was invited to go and photograph inside the Svalbard vault. It's not, most seed banks are not open to the public, so it's very hard to gain access to them. And in my case, Svalbard's only open for 2 days a year when they bring in new seeds. And then the rest of the time, it really serves as like a safety deposit box. It's completely closed. So you can imagine how powerful this experience is where you walk into this cavern that is filled with boxes of living seeds that are in a state of suspended animation, preserved for a distant and unknowable future. And one of the things that doesn't come across when you look at the documentary photographs is the sound and the physical experience of being in a seed bank, because it's awe-inspiring. You really get this sense that you're in the Arctic. You know, I was wearing every single piece of clothing I owned. It was bitterly cold. There was so much wind and so much noise. But then you're really like at one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. And it was just this amazingly powerful experience. So in the 10 years I worked on this, and from my first moment of wanting to photograph this project, this topic, you know, it expanded into this very wide-ranging expeditionary project where I traveled to more than 20 seed banks over 5 continents, photographing this subject. And this is the Barley collection in the historic Vavalive Institute for Plant Industry in St. Petersburg, Russia. And it's a really important historic bank, primarily because it was the first comprehensive seed bank before Svalbard. And it had a very utopian impulse at first. It was founded by Nikolai Vavalive. I almost pointed at my screen, which no one else, of course, in the world could see that I was pointing at my screen. But you can see his portrait in the cabinet. And he was in the early part of the 20th century, made over 100 expeditions to collect plants, to create an archive of biodiversity so they could improve crops and prevent famine. Now, tragically, in World War II, St. Petersburg, where this is located, was under siege by the Nazis for 28 months. And over 600,000 citizens died of St. Petersburg, died of starvation, and including the scientists at the seed bank. And what they had done is, in World War II, they had evacuated the Hermitage, all the paintings and the works of art from there, and but they did not evacuate the seed bank. And I'm sure most of the people watching this know that biodiversity is a unique thing, and that once you lose a particular strain, you can't go back and get it. It may not be in the field anymore. It may be extinct in the wild. And so the scientists, knowing that, they barricaded themselves in and died of starvation rather than eat the seeds under their care. Most seed banks, as you know, I now know a lot about seed banking from my travels, and most seed banks have labs associated with them, national ones do, where they're trying to do research on the methodologies and technologies for extending the life of plants and seeds under their care. But they also have most of them also do crop improvements. And that's because seed banks can't save all biodiversity because they don't have unlimited resources. They have to make choices. And most of the time, even in the biggest banks, what is funded is directly related to humans. So it's usually plants that are seen as beneficial to humans or economically important plants. So it could be food or fuel or forage or even plastics. And this is acai, which they're developing, you know, looking for new food crops that are nutrient dense for an ever-growing population. This is a papaya collection also in Brazil. And what's interesting to me is that I just wanted to show that many plants don't grow from seed with the same characteristics as the parent plants. So in addition to seed banks, this is a crop improvement collection, but there's also live collections of plants that are used for seeds in the wild because they're used as clones. And one of the, you'll notice that there's little powder circles around these, and that's for, it's pesticide. but they're also collecting in Brazil complete ecosystems. So they're collecting nematodes and fungi, because I realize that the seeds themselves are part of a more extensive system that needs to also be preserved. So that's a new aspect of seed banking that's kind of expanding. So as I photographed this constant agonizing quest to preserve the spark of life in these really tiny vulnerable seeds, some of which are no bigger than this, like a tiny grain of sand. These are orchid seeds, which happen to be the smallest types of seeds in the world. But I really wanted to get at the bigger questions about life at radically different scales and what our relationship is with plants. So that led me to collaborate with biologists at the seed banks to create a different kind of imagery. So Archiving Eden has two parts. There is the documentary images of seed banks from around the world that we've been looking at, but also these collages that I make from X-rays of the plants in the collection. So this is called epiphyte, and it's made from orchid brackets in a seed bank in Australia. I was privileged enough to be able to go to 3 seed banks in Australia. And for me, they're more open-ended, they're metaphoric, they have the visual acuity and sharpness of detail that the documentary work does, but they have a more open-ended meaning. And so there's a slippage for me between this kind of descriptive quality of looking at a really finely detailed X-ray of wild seedlings, but also there's a metaphoric quality that speaks to reproductive power or other issues that I've encountered as the questions that rise while I go to the seed banks. And for me, using the X-rays as a way of doing this, for me, has kind of multiple layers of why I might do that. And one is that they use it's scientific imaging that they're looking at for statistical analysis of seeds. So they are looking at seeds, and I've repurposed it with the help of the scientists and the permission of the scientists to look at their research seedlings or seed collections that are used for research purposes because the X-rays damage it. And for me, it's like the notion of looking inside the plants themselves. It's almost like the process of going into a seed bank, and it allows you to see what you can't see with human vision and ask those bigger questions about the spark of life for me. And these are sweet potato clones, which are, a lot of our food supply are grown from clones now. So, one of the things that I encountered time and time again was the exchange of knowledge and plants that happened between the various seed banks and the scientists. So you would go into a seed bank that would have corn literally everywhere in, the world they all have a collection of corn. And it's because crops like corn or barley are great crops for humans, and they're nutrient rich and can be grown in a variety of situations. And so that notion of this giant exchange of information and plants brought me back to the Columbian exchange, of course, where you have East meets West, and the kind of explosion and exchange of knowledge, but also disease agents, right? So in this case, this is dryland flora. These are specimens from the Australian and the US banks that are being grown in a hyper-arid desert location. And so I took samples of the plants that they're growing there. So there are plants that are globally, from everywhere, but they're brought to this one spot where it rains less than an inch a year for research into how to improve crops. Since with climate change, they think that we're going to have a lot of problems with deserts. So that notion of the Columbian exchange and the tie into the historical trade of that, I find super interesting. And in some ways, I think of myself as being part of that, right? That I'm being passed around by the seed banks. The way that I gain access is that I get in one of the scientists will tell me a story about a seed bank and say, you should really go to this seed bank because they're doing this really interesting research. And then I show up and they share the knowledge, and then I kind of go to the next place. But, and now that we're battling COVID, it's very interesting, the pessimistic part of removing plants or agents and then transporting them accidentally or on purpose, how that might unleash a whole series of unintended consequences. So speaking of unintended consequences, this is a piece I did for a biennial in Liverpool, and it's called Then and Now, Potato Diversity in the Irish Diaspora. And of course, with a name like Dornith Doherty, you can probably guess that my family came over with was made to migrate because of the potato famine in Ireland. And so these are actually a collection of blight-resistant potato plants now. And, one of the many, it's a complex cultural and political situation in Ireland that led to this famine. But part of it is that potatoes have a lack of biodiversity. And so when the blight hit, there was no resistance built into the crop. And so when the blight hit, it was all a monoculture and and it was wiped out very quickly, causing widespread famine. And 30% of the population either died or had to leave Ireland, or decided to leave Ireland, I should say. And then and so here we have corn, which is again a great crop, but the system behind it, because it's such an important crop, you can see that the political aspects of trying to grow a lot of it or modifying it over years. It started out as teosinte, which is a very tiny grain, and in Mexico and Central America, it was modified through crossbreeding to become the corn we know today. And it's now entered into our system in the US, where it's kind of a factory crop, where they're trying to produce as much as they can. And they find that having a lack of diversity, having it super monoculture, makes it easier for them to grow lots and lots of it, but of course places us at risk. And in this case, this is one of the things that's too bad about having a digital exhibition rather than a physical one is that I've been making these lenticular prints, and this animation just kind of hints at how beautiful they are when you see them in person. And what this does is, this is a kind of study of biodiverse corn. It's corn in which the husk grows around each kernel instead of the whole ear, so it's kind of like garlic. But it's also about how it's a still image that changes. So even though you have a plant that you're trying to put into a state of suspended animation, you can't really stop time. And of course, things continue to change. And so there's a series of works that, when you see them in person, are quite beautiful. They're lenticular prints, and they change colors as the viewers move by, from green to brown or blue to green, talking about the cryogenic process or the drying or the colors of corn. And I also use color in other ways. This one, of course, for me, still relates to the notion of the Columbian Exchange and the East meets West. So it uses indigo blue, which could, and sometimes when I'm using that color, for me, refers to the process of cryogenic preservation, which is so central to the process of, to the methodology of seed banking. But it also has this, refers to delft or indigo, or delft, which of course talks about the delft blue, that, the way that the ceramic colors and the use of that kind of imagery went from China to Holland to the Dutch to Mexico, and has become this way of speaking in a shorthand term or a visual way about the Columbian exchange for me. And then this, you know, the other thing I should probably talk about is my relationship with the scientists, because they have made it possible in so many ways through their conversations and their collaborations to, you know, for me to make this project and open the door to their technological garden. So it's through conversations, as I mentioned before, that how I, you know, find out what they're doing and what they're thinking about. These are images made from the Millennium Seed Bank in England, and they refer in their organizational structure to the cabinets of curiosities and people like Alfred Wallace, who of course was a famous natural historian and evolutionary theorist. So if you're looking at these, it's their research, but also test garden. And they have from seeds to seedlings to seed heads, which of course are a type of seed banks themselves of all the different types of plants. And one of the reasons I have this one is to talk about the way that we systematize or categorize plants and think about it in organizational structures, but also to talk about the biodiversity of the Millennium Seed Bank itself, because they are trying to bank all of the plants that are possible to bank in England. And so they have gotten very close to collecting all of the possible plants that they can. Some plants don't store well, so they've had to make adjustments for that. And now, interestingly enough, they have moved to their formal colonies and are doing kind of a post-colonial collection where you see collections from the Commonwealth in the Millennium Seed Bank as well. As I mentioned, the seed heads themselves, this is red yucca, which is native to Texas, but they also have kind of a seed bank structure to themselves. So that connection between human systems that echo the natural systems, I think, are really, really interesting. And some of the challenges that I've encountered as I've traveled, this is the Russian, this is not in St. Petersburg. This is a seed bank in Kuban, Russia, and it is soy. And one of the challenges I came up against again and again is that the biodiversity that I find in the seed banks is not really a reflection of the biodiversity of the home country, the national identity. It's really about the resources that they're able to devote to this effort. So I would go in, and this seed bank is super important and in terrible shape. It's not, you know, they don't have the resources to keep them cold enough or to maintain the collection. And once this biodiversity is gone, you know, you can't recapture it. So this is in Australia. It's an antique seed collection that they have that, of course, is not kept refrigerated. But, you know, my experience, so you have the very dark part of it, but then you also have this experience of going to these remote locations where you have individual scientists working on their own, sometimes in very small groups, to preserve biodiversity. And so that really gives me hope. This is another, like to kind of bring us back to Svalbard. When I was there in 2010 for those 2 days to photograph the collection, the white boxes are the US boxes, and the 2 little red boxes are from Uganda. And for me, I was really, that just kind of summed up the notion of resources and dedication. But it also, and I was very sad because, you know, Uganda is one of the most biodiverse places on the planet, but because of political instability, they're not able to put forth the efforts that they might and to preserve the plants for the future. But, you know, and at first I was really, really sad. And then I saw I thought about it a different way, which was that two people or a couple of people found boxes and collected seeds and managed to send those seeds to Svalbard. And so those are safe. And, that it's that kind of dedication that gives you hope for the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dornith. It has been such an interesting sort of revelation about that there are so many different factors that go into such collaborative experiences and processes. And of course, you being an artist and trying to bring these sort of processes to light through the kind of documentation that you do, through the kind of images that you create is also very interesting. And Giovanni, I'd love to also know what you think about Dornith's process, considering that you yourself come from a background of art history and you also study natural history in visual culture. We would love to know what your thoughts are about Dornith's work.
Sure, thank you. Dornith, what a fantastic presentation. I wish it could have gone on for a lot longer. There's so much here to talk about, and one of the things that fascinates me about your work is specifically in relation to issues of visibility and invisibility, which is what I focused on throughout my research on animals and plants in art. Because of course, as you know, the history of science is made of visible and invisible entities, and the way in which we see these natural entities changes our conception of them incredibly. So what I find fascinating is that, we've been looking at plants. My book, Why Look at Plants, which repurposes the very famous, the title of the very famous essay by John Berger, Why Look at Animals, also contains that root of looking, seeing, and therefore conceptualizing. And I think there's something fascinating about looking at plants, the notion of plant blindness, and how plants have always been around us, but we've become blind to them. Or the opposite aspect, which is we look at plants only when they're gorgeous, exotic, eye-catching. And I think that seeds are the ultimate frontier of this visible-invisible paradigm, whereby they are the plant. They are like, if you like, the soul of the plant. And I shiver as I say this, but they're also near invisible in two ways. Sometimes, as you pointed out, they're so tiny that we need magnifying tools. We just won't be seeing much with the naked eye. But at times, they're also not particularly pleasing when we can see them as a grown plant. They're not quite as eye-catchy in a traditional sense. Macrophotography recently has showed us the architectural beauty of seeds. So I feel that your work explores this interesting interfaces in which visibility and invisibility play important roles in our understanding of plants as connected to everything, not just as objects, aesthetic objects. So there's a sense of freeing up plants from this burden, which is this kind of objectification. It's a beautiful living organism or a preserved organism. So the way in which you use photography, X-ray, and different processes, imaging processes, to render what is invisible or less visible, visible in an interesting way, really fascinates me. I don't know if you want to say something about that process, since you engage with it in so many different ways.
Well, thank you, Giovanni. What a nice thing to say. Well, there's so many threads of what you touched on right then to kind of tease out, and but the notion of making the visible invisible, the invisible visible, is really at the core for me. And interestingly enough, photography in some ways there's that William J. Mitchell essay about, I'm going to forget the title, but he talks about the notion of, like systems of making images to bring the far away closer. And, first that you send out somebody to get a physical archaeological record and they dig it up, and then there's the drawing of it. And then finally, we have photography bringing the moon, that we send people to the moon with cameras to bring back these images of inaccessible places or things that you wouldn't have access to. And, right now we're kind of participating in that right now with a Zoom meeting. You're in Chicago, I'm in Texas, they're in India. And that notion of bringing something that you couldn't see by yourself closer through the system of capturing light rays off something and then projecting it onto another surface, either a sensor or a piece of paper, is like one of my favorite things about photography. And that indexical relationship that is kind of going away, where you're standing in front of seeds in a seed bank in the Arctic and you're catching light rays off of it onto a light sensitive material. Because at the time I was using view cameras, so I had a 4x5 sheet of film. And that notion that you were somehow collecting emanations onto this piece of paper that becomes your own, that are invisible and yet they make a record, for me is just such a great part of photography. But then, to take it into the seeds, that, that notion of the invisibility of seeds, and when they're really of key importance, and, and that the notion that we could restart a whole ecosystem just by collecting these tiny seeds. Or, that in the US, they're trying to do, for mitigating wildfires, they're collecting native seeds in an attempt to, if there's a wildfire, be able to reestablish it. But that fundamental importance that we don't even think about, and now I see, I encounter seeds everywhere, right? From jewelry to, popcorn. And you don't even think about them. And so it's very interesting, that notion. And I'm working on a project right now about air and microscopic air pollution and the way that it travels around the world. And I'm using scanning electron microscope imagery. I'm making images of bird feathers that have collected the dust as they kind of swim through this atmospheric ocean of dust, as a way of rendering visual something. This is off topic, sorry about that, but like, that the atmosphere is invisible until it kind of coalesces into the haze of distance, right? Or if you have really bad pollution, you may see it. But that question of how do you render that visible, or an object that you can think about and raise questions? And for me, bringing it back to the seed bank, that's the interesting part for me, is that people, like, I didn't know what a seed bank was before I started the project or read that article. And then, but then it becomes a way of opening conversations about what is our relationship as stewards of the environment and of these living beings into the future, right? So that's my interest in it now, is that it's allowed me to have conversations that I, ask people to consider it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dornith. In fact, my next question that I jotted down notes about that I wanted to ask you is about the actual term bank. It's interesting how you also mentioned cabinets of curiosities. So I know that your work is concerned with the idea of collecting and the history of collecting, which is not necessarily connected to the history of banks. And then the seed banks collapse different economic registers with historical practices. And I was wondering, especially in the light of your comment right now of stewardship, which is such a fraught word right now in the humanities in relation to nature, I was wondering what are your thoughts on the word bank in the context of seed banks?
I know, isn't that interesting, the way that it ties into economic systems?
Immediately.
Right, and then the way that it's so dependent on like economic resources, and it's also seen as valuable. Yeah, it's so funny because it's so layered. But I wish I had an opportunity, and I wasn't thinking clearly, obviously, but I had this opportunity to photograph a 500-year-old citrus collection in Florence at a Medici palace, and that's in the project. And that one is so interesting, and in that very way, right? That, seed banks come out of agricultural practices, but they also come out of these huge natural history collections where people were collecting rare plants like tulips or citrus, and then making collections of those and organizing them. And, in some ways, those preserve them for the future as well. So yeah, it's super interesting.
And how do you feel about this notion of stewardship? There's something I find interesting about, it's incredible that the seed banks exist, and I think it's great that they exist, but I wonder, there's a utopianist quality and an apocalyptic quality to them, where I feel like the seed banks are the incarnation of this desperate attempt to preserve what we have been destroying, and attempt to somehow preserve what is preservable in the face of climate change, which, as we know, is moving plants around the globe. It's going to affect the living environments of these plants to a point that we will have to rethink where you can seed some of the seeds that are kept in these banks. So just the notion of stewardship and biodiversity, I'm just thinking about letting go, the two poles of philosophical concern in the sense of the conception of nature. Should we just let go and let it happen, or is this bank conception bringing us back to administration, management, rationalization, and nature as resource that then becomes the source of the very problem with nature itself?
Yes. Well, and when you, so I have a couple of thoughts about that. The notion that we have, reduced it to the point that, with climate change, for instance, they were doing all sorts of research of having salt-resistant rice, or rice that can not drown if there is a flood, right? And all of that is because of the changes that we're seeing with climate change, that the seas will rise, and a lot of those coastal areas, which is where rice is oftentimes grown, will be one of the first affected, and it's a huge crop for worldwide, for life. So that notion of trying to manage this, key to feeding thousands and thousands of people through managing its biodiversity in a race against time to kind of find all the strains of rice that have not been cultivated so they could possibly help for unforeseen problems in the future. That is so dystopian, right? That it's come to this. And then, but I can't help but think that, I encountered in Australia a plant that is only grown in one spot, and companies have to fund plant surveys before they disrupt the soil. And so they discovered this plant and were able to save it. But, who knows if it'll be able to regenerate in some other, surely it's a tiny little, but part of it for me is this hopeful part, is that, that you don't know what the future will bring. And so having this archive, right, gives me this tiny bit of hope. But of course, like people say to me, Yeah, but if the worst comes to worst, there's total apocalypse, no one's going to remember the seed bank or have a key to the door or any of those things, right? And in Svalbard itself, you know, they built it to last the ages, at least 200 years, and it's already had a flood from the permafrost melting, and it's, you know, 12 years old. So the best laid plans, right? That notion. But then somebody else asked me a question which I thought was amazing is, have we co-evolved with plants in a way that has made us their agent of transportation? You know, this notion of them being fixed. But now, you know, they've made them, we're so dependent on them that we move them around the planet, and, you know, corn is literally found everywhere, and rice is, you know, that's an interesting part too.
Yeah, the idea that plants have domesticated us.
Oh, right.
Yeah, absolutely. And another really interesting aspect of your work, and you phrased it so well in your presentation, is the idea of radical different scales.
Oh, yeah.
And I was wondering if you could tell us more about what's important in your work in the context of these radical different scales. It seems like right now we're so much more interested in scales in this respect. There are different stories that can be told by considering different scales. And in this case, I think seeds encapsulate time frames that exceed sometimes our own lives. There's, of course, the idea of the visual and vision, and how, you know, the actual scale of their lives can also be productive in our case, in the case of seed banks, because there's a storage possibility. I'm thinking, you know, they're not all as big as coconuts, which would probably make the storing in banks quite complicated. So there are all these factors of different scales playing into the seed banks, and then again in your work. How do you decide, for instance, to represent, to enlarge? To what scale do you enlarge seeds to make them visible?
Well, part of that is the limitations of the images, right? So I'm making, by using X-ray, right? I'm able, there's part of it is scale, but part of it is also that you're actually getting to see inside of things.
Mm-hmm.
So and it's interesting to me the way that people respond to these tiny, tiny seeds when they're blown up. They're usually about 1 meter by 1 meter, the images are, the just individual seeds. But when you look at that, that changes what people think it might be, because sometimes they look like pictures of the stars or the sun or aquatic, like jellyfish. They shift in a way that their identity is really shifting to. And I think that notion of scale, of how we think about what it is and how the entity changes when you can see this enlarged thing that you might just see as a little black dot, and then it blows up, and then you see all these really beautiful details to it, I think is really interesting, and allows again for that notion of the way that you feel small when you contemplate the universe, right? That it goes the other way, that there are these little tiny universes all around us that we don't really think about. But the other thing is, for me, is like the notion that we are trying to plan something that will last, you know, is a time capsule, that we are going to have somebody, you know, maintain for 200 years or more, that they could live without care for 200 years more is what they're trying to do. But with care, they're thinking they can extend the life even farther. And so that notion of kind of extending beyond our lifespans, which of course is not what, you know, plants routinely live 200 years, right? So that notion of where we fit into that, and our short-sightedness because of that, I think is really interesting. But, you know, they've found seeds and pods that they, you know, rice that's 2,000 years old that still germinates without any particular care. And they found a 35,000-year-old tuber that sprouted in the permafrost in Siberia. So that time scale of like the human world relationship is so interesting.
Oh yeah, it is. And listening to you right now, I'm also thinking about the sublime and how, you know, we've been talking about scales and we've been talking about this notion of life that resides in a kind of almost embryonic way, incubating for so long. And I'm wondering if there's also, in relation to your use of blue in your work, if there's also a spiritual connotation to your approach to seeds that you see, or even if it's not expressed in the work, is it something that you consider when you create your images?
Well, you know, I did name it Archiving Eden, right? So it has this kind of Christian biblical era. And I really wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking more about the metaphoric garden, right? The metaphoric original garden.
Yeah.
When I titled it. But yeah, it's often there is a spiritual quality that people recognize. And I think the kind of celestial blue has that, you know, people connect that in that way. But it's not the first thing on my mind. It's more about that spark of life, which I guess you could interpret as being that.
And you've been also briefly mentioning the importance of institutions and working with scientists, which I guess it's essential to your work. And, you know, on Antenna, just last year, we had 2 issues dedicated to art and science. I'm very close to communities of bioartists who work around the world. And we're all aware of the challenges, not just the productivities that can emerge from collaborations between artists and scientists. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the specific. You know, when we say also art and science, we're dealing with 2 enormous fields with many different personalities, depending on what type of art and what type of science we engage with. So I was wondering, in this specific case with seed banks, if you have encountered specific challenges or you know, even like methodology require the special kind of attention in order to address issues with terminology sometimes, or maybe even the mistrust that sometimes artists who work in a scientific context report that they were seeing as the outsider coming in without the scientific rigor.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I often jokingly call this project 50 First Dates, because, you know, I show up with all this gear, right? Like, you know, tripod and now I have a digital stitching head so I can make these giant images, and I have to, and I'm going into these like super secure spaces and making pictures, right? Like within a day of meeting somebody, I am in their space making that image. And part of that is like establish trust really quickly. And for me, there's a few scientists where I've worked with them on an ongoing basis over the years to use their labs to do the X-ray machines. And yes, there's this totally different point of view. Usually, the first set of questions I had to overcome was like, there's nothing here that's of interest or worthy of your making images of. And I was like, well, just give me a chance. And so they kept saying yes. And, you know, and then I would go, well, look at you using this X-ray machine to make these statistical analyses. Do you mind if I use it? And then they would say yes. And so for me, I had, you know, the conversations were great. We didn't understand each other at all. And so finding a common language was a challenge, but it also kind of led to these kind of sparks where they hadn't really thought about doing, you know, X-raying tissue samples. So there would be excitement when they would say, oh, well, can you get that? You know, maybe do you think you could make an image of that? And I would say, well, let's just give that a try, right? So for me, I had a mostly positive experience because, you know, it's the kind of collaboration where I'm not having to get consensus on a decision. They are working it as if I was a visiting researcher working on my own project. So they're like toddlers side by side playing together, right? Where they allow me to use, and usually there's somebody to make sure that I'm not, a bull in the china shop breaking things. And then after a while, they're like, oh, she's perfectly fine. And then they let me go to make these images, but it's really just allowing me access and the opportunity to do it. And then, and then it's interesting to them because no one could be more surprised than they were when it ended up becoming, it was like an American Airlines magazine or something, and some senator saw it. And so that, it affected their funding. And what an interesting thing, this notion of like these beautiful images that someone said, talks about. It was just, I think there's maybe one documentary image. It was just the X-rays. And, then there's this positive feedback loop that gets established. And plus they're interested to see it because it celebrates their work, I think, and they work in isolation, as I said, or on these projects that take forever, so having somebody who's interested, I think, is positive. So I haven't found many negative experiences, right? Part of it is just, for me, the challenge has been fundraising for travel and, access, and that's really been the challenge but, once I get there, I've literally, I get off a plane sometimes without language capabilities, like in Cuban. I just get off the plane and I just trust that there's going to be a scientist there. And sure enough, there's a scientist there, picks me up and knows somebody I know, and, off we go. So it's been a very positive thing for me.
That's great to hear. I also wanted to ask you if you have, over this incredible journey through seed banks around the world, if you have become fond of a particular seed for whatever reason, one that really stands out to you.
I have, that's interesting. I am always interested in the seeds in front of me, right? Like, so when I'm working, it's like the most beautiful thing is the thing in front of me. But I'm really interested in the challenge of bananas because it ties into the history. Bananas are predicted to go extinct. They are battling a blight, very similar to the potato blight. And so, and they evidently, the Lord Cavendish banana that we're eating now, or that is in wide distribution. I don't know what they have in India, but I know in the US and on the Western Hemisphere, the most common banana that you encounter is the Lord Cavendish, and they think it's going to go extinct. There's the second banana. There was another banana that was better that went extinct, and then they replaced it with the Lord Cavendish. And in Brazil, I encountered there, I think will replace the Lord Cavendish, and it's very good. But the notion of like this fruit that doesn't produce many seeds, and the story about trying to find a way to get it to reproduce and finding the seeds and crossbreeding. I find that one, I'm very interested in that right now. I'm also interested in corn and potatoes because of my personal history.
It has indeed been a very enlightening conversation. Thank you, Dornith and Giovanni, for sharing your valuable perspectives with our audience. I'd like to remind our audience that the speakers will be present for a Q&A session just after this. So please leave your questions in the chat box and don't forget to join the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Giovanni. That was fun. Super fun. And
thank you.
Thanks to everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
To Dornith and Giovanni Aloi, and to you everyone who's joined us this evening. Welcome to the third day of PHYTOPIA. our exhibition. We are Science Gallery Bengaluru, and we have started programming about 10 months ago. We are a new institution, and we are a part of an international network of 8 galleries across the world. But in Bangalore, we are established with funding from the government of Karnataka, and we work in partnership with the Indian Institute of Science, the National Center for Biological Sciences, and Srishti Institute of Art, Design, and Technology. This program is also organized in collaboration with the Bangalore International Center. Please may I also at this moment alert you to fill the feedback form, and you can post your questions as we proceed with the evening in the Q&A box. Allow me to briefly introduce to you our guests for this evening. A 2012 Guggenheim Foundation Fellow, Dornith Doherty is an American artist working primarily with photography, video, and scientific imaging. Dornith was born in Houston, Texas, and has studied at Rice University and Yale University. Her work has been featured widely in the United States as well as abroad. Collaborating with scientists and seed banks on over 5 continents, she has traced in precise detail the elaborate systems of secure spaces and technological interventions required for botanical preservation. She reflects upon poetic questions about life and time through artworks created from X-rays, captured from seeds, tissue samples, and cloned plants preserved in these collections. Dornith's work, Archiving Eden, is displayed in PHYTOPIA. So those of you who haven't had the chance to visit the exhibition, we welcome you. The exhibition is open for the next 10 days. Giovanni Aloi is an art historian who studied in Milan and then at Goldsmiths University, London. Giovanni currently teaches at the School of Art Institute of Chicago, Sotheby's Institute of Art in New York, and the Tate Galleries in London. His first book was titled Art and Animals and was published in 2011. He has been the editor-in-chief of Antenna, the Journal of Nature in Visual Culture. And we are grateful that Giovanni and his colleagues have permitted us to display 2 issues of Antenna, Why Look at Plants and Beyond Morphology, which you will find in PHYTOPIA's reading room. Let us proceed with the evening. This discussion follows a lecture that was premiered a few minutes ago and ended a few minutes ago, with Dornith first outlining for us her practice and the absolutely fascinating images that she has from these seed banks across the world, followed by a conversation with Giovanni, where he asked her questions that, you know, only a person with his training could have asked, because I have very different questions for Dornith. So to sum up in a couple of sentences, and Dornith and Giovanni, please, let me know if there's anything more you wanted to add or if I've misrepresented you in any way. To sort of bring it all together, what Dornith does does in the project Archiving Eden, about which she has spoken to us this evening, is that she visits seed banks across the world, as I mentioned, and then images them using X-rays, but also sometimes regular photography of the places themselves, which are equally fascinating photographs. And then these images at a scale at which one doesn't usually imagine seeing them are displayed as artworks, which allows us an insight into these embryos of life, as Giovanni called them, and Dornith, I think, also called them, in a very, very different way. In fact, some of the images, as you know, my team and I were looking at them after reaching out to Dornith. My team members were trying to fool me by asking me, okay, what do you think this is? Is this a seahorse? Is this a this? Is this a that? Without, of course, me knowing what they were actually asking me about. So they're quite incredible images, which you will see in the exhibition. So what we have is a fascination with seed banks that Dornith brings to us. And in an exhibition on plants, of course, it's most appropriate. In Giovanni, we have an interpreter and interlocutor who looks at these images, of course, as a cultural historian, as an art historian, looking at how natural history gets represented in visual culture. So May I sort of begin the evening and use my privilege to ask you the first set of questions? May I begin by talking to you, Giovanni, as we've sort of had Dornith's explanatory lecture just a few minutes ago, and then come back after you to Dornith again to bring it all again together. So, Giovanni, would you like to tell us in a few words what is it about nature, and especially botany or plants, that you find interesting in your own work, and how does that manifest itself in the work we do with Antenna and the fabulous 2 volumes that you've allowed us to display?
Thank you. And thank you for having me, of course. Well, it's a complicated question to answer, and yet I guess probably the easiest. I could talk about it for 2 hours, so I'm going to keep it really short. But I was always interested in art and nature since I was a kid. And it was just a matter of understanding as I grew up how they could be combined, or whether I had to choose one or the other. And, growing up in Italy, our education system was very structured and old-fashioned, so it seemed like I would have to choose one or the other, and I ended up choosing art because I wasn't too fluent in chemistry and biology, so I saw that as a bit of a hurdle in my love for nature. But when I moved to London and I studied art at Goldsmiths, they enabled me to research nature and art together, which was a fantastic turning point in my life. There's a history of art and nature that's very complicated. I wrote about it in different works, different books and articles, and nature has always been the underdog in art. We always privilege ourselves. Art, you can say to a certain degree around the world, and especially in Western art, has been thoroughly anthropocentric. It's about us, reflections of us. And even when we have painted animals and plants throughout history, we've turned them into symbols of ourselves or our emotions and our ethical values or morals. So even when we see animals and plants in the paintings or sculptures, they really represent us once again. And I believe that that's the biggest issue in our relationship with nature. We're not able to see nature beyond ourselves. And that also plays a major role in climate change, in our lack of appreciation for nature itself and interest in nature itself. I find incredibly surprising that we're not more strongly denouncing our state of alienation in relation to nature. It is always surprising to me to think that we find it acceptable not to know the names of our trees, or what the trees on our streets do, or what cycles of nature entail. We're just being miseducated not to care about nature. And what I try to do with my work is to enthuse people about nature generally through Antenna and through my publications, and also to provide alternatives, ways to engage with nature through art, and explain why art actually can make people consider nature from a different perspective, because in a sense, other disciplines have failed us.
Interesting. And I actually find it quite fascinating that you connect our sort of, in a way, lack of love for nature and, climate change, which is a challenge that we confront today. And, in fact, when we organized our exhibition Submerge, which was about water, and we moved away very consciously from talking about water as a resource to talk about, water as an entity, right? It's quirky, it's fascinating, it just defies all kinds of rules. And someone asked me, why did you choose this approach? And the answer, in a way, it emerged as I was answering that person, which is that, in a way, what we want people to do is to love water, because when you love and care for something, in many ways, the conservation aspects of it or the care aspects of it are not things you have to convince people of. If you take care of the basic, if you create a basic relationship, and it's quite actually astonishing that we find ourselves in a time that this relationship is so broken. that we need to kind of, reconsider how we even frame discussing nature. Would you have sort of memories or interesting things that you would probably want to share with our audiences about the 2 volumes that we have shared? If I'm putting you on the spot, tell me.
No, absolutely not. They've been published a long time ago. That was 2011, and they came out of a sense of tiredness with a certainty in academia of what an animal was. At the time, I was lucky enough to be part of an extremely exciting group of scholars in London who really pioneered animal studies. The discipline of animal studies, for those who are not familiar with it, although it has become really prominent over the past few years, started towards the end of the 90s. And again, like in art, where nature has been sort of underdog, overlooked subject, the same can be said about philosophy. So scholars from different disciplines, including literature, art, history, philosophy, and animal husbandry, all started together in order to fill that void. And what I found the environment extremely stimulating, interesting, and fertile. However, a few years into it, we're talking about 2011, so 10 years into it, I felt like there was a lot of reliance on scientific conceptions of what an animal in animal studies might be. And I noticed that conversations became very animal-centric. So the claim of animal studies was to be non-anthropocentric. And I started to wonder if it was fair or right or productive to shift the paradigm from anthropocentrism to animal centrism. And I started to wonder more about ecosystems. And at the same time, there was a rise in interest in the concept of the Anthropocene, and climate change began to predominate, and plants kept being left out. So the 2 issues that you very kindly decided to include in the exhibition were a statement, a kind of provocation and a bit of a protest to actually use a space like Antenna that had revolved around animal studies mainly until that point, and make it into a space for plants, at least for 2 issues. And one of the things that I remember very fondly from those 2 issues is the discussion among scholars that I initiated that worked really well at a time where social media wasn't quite in our bloodstreams as it is today. I think today it's very easy to just post something on Facebook and trigger a discussion on a subject. You'll get lots of comments. Instead, at that time, in the prehistory of the social dimension, I set up a blog and I asked a number of scholars who were part of the animal studies circle to contribute. And when I say scholars, I also mean artists who are involved in the subject. I don't really draw a line between the 2 categories. In fact, I think we should just eliminate them. And it was really interesting to notice that many scholars were very engaged in the question of the plant. So it was taken seriously. That certainly is one of my highlights on those issues, beyond the many interesting contributions, because it really captures the moment and it captures people's concerns. There are concerns about bringing plants forward and the idea that it might challenge animal rights or take away something from vegan politics, or if I have to have compassion for plants, then what can I eat? There were so many interesting questions I think we raised in that discussion. And when I say we, I mean Antenna, but also everyone who participated, that then have become central to the conversation of critical plant studies when it developed a few years thereafter. So that's certainly my most interesting memory of that journey.
Lovely. Thank you, Giovanni. To our audiences, do bear in mind, I'm not the only one allowed to ask questions, so do please post your questions in the Q&A box. Dornith, if I may move to you and ask you my first, and the question that I really have been wanting to ask you for a while. How was it to go to Svalbard? because it's just an absolutely fascinating place. So my question is, did they give you a rifle? Did they warn you against polar bears? What was it like to go to Svalbard?
It was, Svalbard was the initial seed bank that I read about in an article written by John Seabrook in the New Yorker called Sowing for the Apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
And before that time, I was not familiar with seed banks. And, but I read about Svalbard, and it was such a shocking vision. It was so simultaneously apocalyptic and then utopian that this, one guy had spent 35 years trying to establish a Noah's Ark. I really wanted to go, but it's only open for like 2 days a year when they accession new seeds. It's not a research site like most national gene banks, where they have a research arm that has labs and scientists working on a variety of topics. It's really like a giant safety deposit box based on individual contributions by nations. So the diplomatic part of it is really complicated, and up until that time, it was not something that, it's not an ecotourism site, and in fact, it's built very much like a bunker. So I started working in the U.S. for 2 years, and then got an invitation to accompany Carrie Fowler and Ulla Westingen when they went to make deposits in March of 2010. So walking into that space after working at seed banks all around, and then walking into this amazing one that inspired the whole project was incredible. And what you can see from the outside in Svalbard is just this little tiny green light and an entry door, and then the rest of it is submerged in the mountaintop. So it's really quite dramatic when you walk into it. And there's a long tunnel that goes down that had like ribbons of ice going down on either side. And they monitor it remotely during the time that it's not open. And, it was super interesting because it's one of those places that took me 2 days to get there. You fly in ever smaller planes, and then you land on an airstrip that's like, one of the places where they roll up a little metal stairway. There's no, I live in Dallas, so there's a huge airport, and, so, and then we flew over with the seeds, and they brought them in by hand in a little wagon. They unloaded it, and by hand would carry it down this long tunnel. So it was just really, as you're standing there, and it's like, I'm from Texas, it's super hot here, and I was wearing literally every piece of clothing I owned. And I was bundled up and so cold, and so much in awe about the notion of being in this super biodiverse place. So it was a really profound experience for me. And, and also difficult, the conditions are difficult. It's difficult to make photographs in there. at the time I was still using film. So I had a view camera, which is a big 19th century technology, very mechanical. And all my photography friends were like, well, there's no way you can go to the North Pole without taking a digital camera as a backup. There's too many things that can go wrong. So of course that was the camera that froze. So after 8 hours of being in this super cold, no matter what I would do, I was wearing batteries, up against my body, and then, but the 19th century camera just never broke. So it was amazing, even though it's at one point a polar wind, I was up behind it. There's a picture that is from that moment where I'm standing on the ridge behind the vault itself, and a polar wind comes up and picks me up and the camera. And I just slide, I thought I was going all the way down the mountain, but I, stopped myself right at the base of the entry. So it was super, super interesting and super inspiring.
So it is, well, I was about to say it sounds like an expedition. It doesn't actually sound like it is an expedition.
Oh yeah, it's clearly. Oh, and about the polar bears, it's interesting because people kept giving me advice. They were like, in all seriousness, they would say, if you're in a place that usually has seals and there are no seals, that there's a polar bear around. And they evidently put their paw over their nose, so it's the only black part, so they're completely camouflaged. And I was like, okay, well, I'm from Texas. I don't know where seals are supposed to be. And so it was hilarious. So yeah, everybody carried rifles with them, when we were out and about. It was really quite, made an impression on me.
Wonderful. Could you, I mean, I could listen to this for a long time. Could you tell us a little bit more about, so did you manage to visit also the St. Petersburg Vavalive seed collection as well?
I did. And that was another challenging entry, but so important. And they were very generous with their time and their access. And that is such an amazing seed bank, and especially for its history, which if people have watched I think I go into the history a little bit when I talk about the work. We recorded that a couple of weeks ago, but so it's in the original palace that Vavalive started it in. And so you're walking into rooms that are like the origin point for a really important, the first comprehensive seed bank in the world was there. And then I also went to Kuban, which is about 1,000 miles away, and photographed their kind of research station seed bank, which is a village of about 1,000 people, called Botanica. And then I also went to a couple of other seed banks where they had research stations around St. Petersburg where they kept some of the live collections as well, that have to be kept in fields as live collections rather than, they don't have an extensive cryogenic facility for cloned plants, so they keep them as live collections. So I was able to photograph that, which was really interesting as well. So all in all, I went to 4 places in Russia.
Wow. Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. And the third one, I thought I would, after having asked you about the 2 places that I wish I would have visited, I want to ask you about a third, which would be, which of the seed banks that you visited across the world in a way touched you most? Maybe the story, maybe the politics, maybe the, whatever. But why? Yeah. So I'd like to know which one has touched you most, and why does it stay with you?
Well, in each seed bank, I would have conversations with the scientists that were very inspirational, just because they would have some aspect related to their research or the collections and the kind of efforts that they make. So in each way, every time I would go, I would have some amazing kind of eye-opening moment of an aha moment that would be very profound. But, Svalbard is hard to beat because of it being the inspiration and the narrative of a doomsday ball behind it. And then, of course, Russia was important too, because they really did have that doomsday moment where, 600,000 people died of starvation in that city. And while the seed bank was there, and this scientist died of starvation protecting the seeds. So all of that complicated history is moving, but I think the inspirational aspect of Svalbard is wonderful, because it really talks about people collaborating to solve issues. And so the hope that's embedded in Svalbard for me is a very important aspect of seed banking as a process in general.
Thank you. So, what I find fascinating is the discussion that you've mentioned it now, but you were also in the discussion with Giovanni about why even the need for a seed bank, right? And therefore on the one hand, the Garden of Eden or the Noah's Ark aspect of it, where you find representation for everything that belongs or everything that grows on this planet. But at the same time, of course, it is being preserved for a catastrophic or an apocalyptic situation when we no longer have access to any of this. And at this moment, we are somewhere in between, right? Inching, of course, towards the catastrophe, but somewhere sort of on that scale, where monocultures in monoculture in agriculture especially, and so we had Gabriela Sotolaveaga talk yesterday about the Green Revolution and Mexico and India, and and that came up quite strongly. What the Green Revolution or industrial agriculture, one might say, right? The Green Revolution is one part of the larger story of industrial agriculture in the 20th century, with the Soviet Union leading it in one way, the Western Bloc leading it in another way. But the idea was in a sense converging, right? Like where it's massive, large scale landholding, be it the state, be it industrial farming, and monocropping, as a result of which we lost a lot of crop variety, plant variety, and for lack of a better word, biodiversity. And I'm just trying to kind of make sense of how, between these two sort of, the catastrophe and the utopia, we are here in the here and now. Have you seen seed banks in a way intervene, or which are seed banks you saw intervene in this situation to make an argument for reintroduction of diversity back, especially into food? Because it's also an argument that takes into account, on the one hand, it's agriculture, on the other hand, it's biodiversity, and the two meeting is a very sort of, the interface is very, or not, it's not an interface. The two meeting is a very it's not a very populated land, right? Like where the discussion on biodiversity is all about rewilding, for example. Or not all, but for the bulk of it. And then agriculture is, of course, about feeding people and food security and tackling hunger. So in your experience, having talked to various scientists, having seen various seed banks, where do you see them and when do you see them intervening?
Well, I think that, it's such an interesting topic and such an interesting issue. And so I think that the word that might be problematic is intervention. Because literally all of the seed banks are trying to preserve as much biodiversity through, like perhaps in an agricultural sense, they collect all the varieties of a kind of crop that are wild relatives, in addition to the main crops, as a way for crop improvement or disease and pest resistance that's would not be dependent on. I mean, they see the threat of monoculture. I mean, that's really their underlying issue, is to preserve as much biodiversity around these key crops as possible. Now, one of the things that I think Giovanni talks about in his book, Why Look at Plants, and it's kind of a theme that he comes back to, is the whole human-centered nature of our decision-making about plants that can be very short-sighted, where we're looking at economically important plants, and because resources are so limited, it's really, and many times specifically, about what do we know already benefits humans. So maybe it's food, maybe it's timber, maybe it's forage for animals, maybe it's botanical, horticultural specimens for beauty. But very few of the seed banks are able to have the access to resources to save, wild plants that there's no known use for. Now, in Australia, because of the rareness, they're very aware of that. And so anytime they destroy, they're going to go in, like a mining company is required to do, there's a botanical survey, and they, an impact statement, and they collect before they ever disturb the land. So, but I think that's something that I think Giovanni's talked about quite a bit too, in terms of plant blindness and thinking about it from this very human-centered point of view.
Giovanni, do you want to step in and say maybe in a few words a little more about your book?
Sure. Just wanted to continue on Dornith's point, and also, Genevieve, harken back to what you said earlier. The idea of nature and resource has come in already, no surprise, I guess. And part of, I think, the conversation Dornith and I had also touched on this idea that it is a complicated, inescapable conundrum that we face as human beings. We depend on nature, and the management of nature in a way or another ends up happening. It has to happen if we want to survive. It's a contingency defined by the number of humans on this planet. Right. We can't just rely on foraging. Imagine a world in which only like a few hundreds of humans were scattered around the globe, then foraging would be still a viable mode of survival. But clearly the management of nature, which many locates back to the origin of agriculture, has defined life on this planet, not just our life. And we do find, there's a very interesting work in the exhibition on indigo. And indigo is such an important plant. I had a meeting of a reading group that I've set up a year ago called Botanical Speculation, dedicated entirely to that plant. And it's one of the plants that really controlled European as well as US markets, the history of India. When you follow the history of indigo, you follow histories that are economic as well as environmental and cultural, that are intimately intertwined in beautiful and horrific ways as well. There are always histories of exploitation, slavery, beauty. It's impossible to find the steady ground. The ground keeps on shifting as you explore the story and find it extremely fascinating and horrifying. And I think, in a sense, this kind of in-between moment that you're describing, Janavi, has similar characters. There's a beauty to understanding the planet and how it works on a deeper level, and learning how to relate to it differently. And at the same time, there's always this terrible shadow of doom upon us. And the real question of what is our true viable relationship with nature that we're trying to envision. There are many philosophers who have written recently about climate change, and how, I'm thinking, for instance, of Timothy Morton and his idea of hyperobjects, and this idea of an ecology without nature, and that the idea of nature itself as something separate from us is the root of the problem. And yet, it's always complicated or near impossible to transfer those ideas to practical living. It would be beautiful for us to live with nature in a way that doesn't entail this separation, that doesn't entail the conception of resource, objectification, exploitation, extraction, but ultimately it's impossible. And I think the number of us on this planet is seriously placing pressure, putting a lot of pressure on this relationship and our ability or inability to re-envision it, or the possibility to re-envision it.
I like the way you spoke about the shadow of tragedy or shadow of melancholy, because if we look at the history of the last 500 years, we could we could write that story through the history of so many plants, as so many of our colleagues have, right? If you look at the history of cotton, I mean, the history of cotton is a history of colonization, history of slavery, history of international trade, the beginning of the American Civil War, and therefore decline of cotton trade with the Americas for Britain, and therefore the ascent of cotton trade from India, for example, right? So large geopolitical shifts and the cultivation of plants such as cocoa, sugarcane, and the Caribbean, for example, or if we were to kind of step back even in time again, the spice trade, right? Which is what enlivened the western coast of India for decades. But I'm anticipating some other talks that might hopefully bring this more into relief. But I'm glad you bring this up, because this it's again how do we separate, right? Like nature and culture, almost as if they weren't of the same cloth. They are of, and I like the way that you reiterate that argument again and again. I'll embarrass myself a little bit and move on to questions from the audience. And so please do send in more of your questions. I'll start now. So this is a question from Suraj for you, Dornith. Suraj would like to know if the collections in these international seed banks have been sent back, especially to conflict zones where previously existing seed banks were destroyed.
Yes, I know that in Syria, for instance, recently, the first withdrawal from the seed bank in Svalbard was the wheat collection had to be withdrawn so that they could reestablish wheat seed banks. Some seed banks are national, and then some are kind of consortiums around a particular really important crop. Wheat is one of them. And in Aleppo, the scientists couldn't get to the seed bank in Aleppo because of the conflict there. And so they reestablished, they did a withdrawal, grew out new seeds, and made a new seed bank with that same biodiversity in two places this time, in Morocco and Lebanon. So yes, that does indeed happen. It's, it's not necessarily the ultimate doomsday scenario, but it certainly, reflects our political, situation right
now. The second question from Lawrence Hill is also for Dornith. In the talk that we just saw, and the discussion with Giovanni, he talked about making the invisible visible with reference to nature. And you spoke in also making scientists and their research, visible. So in the kind of work you do. And Lawrence would like to ask you to expand on this second aspect of making the research visible. And I think it is a fascinating question, especially for us at Science Gallery, where we are trying to kind of find, one of the reasons why your work is fascinating is precisely because you work at that edge, of science and art, and like Giovanni does at science and the humanities, and art and the humanities. And so, yes, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your kind words about my work. It's interesting because there's no scientists. I took portraits of the scientists as I was working many times, but there are no people in the series at all. And part of that is to really have people be able to, because it's a dual project. There's the documentary work, which really shows the interiors of these spaces and their lab spaces and the seed banks themselves. But for me, it's really the metaphoric part of it that that allows, I want people to really think about these, the way that the research impacts through metaphor also. And so the X-ray pictures where you have the seeds looking like perhaps they're moving, or the lenticular prints, which we have an animation in the exhibition that kind of references that, where you have plants going from green to blue, talking about the cryogenic process, that part speaks to that, the difficulty of it, making those time frames visible or the efforts of the scientists visible as they try to slow down time. So, you know, to make the seeds last longer. I hope that was an okay answer to that question.
Well, we'll hear, hopefully. If Lawrence, you have a follow-up question, please do send it in.
Yeah.
The next question, I think, is probably directed at the both of you. It's Suraj wanting to know, how do you think galleries or museums can mediate the increasing distance between humans and plants, especially in urban spaces?
Giovanni, do you want to start?
Sure, I can. It's a complicated question. There is a history of plants coming into the gallery space, and our traditional institutions like the biggest museums in the world and creating havoc just on biological grounds. One of the earliest documented exhibitions involving plants was at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It was Steichen's delphiniums that came in the 30s, and they were the first flowers, living flowers, to be presented as works of art in a context of a museum of international importance. And ever since, bringing living plants in the gallery space has been a bit of an ambition, because representing something, of course, is not quite the same as creating an encounter. Or let's say that they're both valid ways of creating an encounter, proposing an encounter, but they're very different. And of course, we can argue too that once we bring a plant, a living organism, in a gallery space, it's no longer really a plant in a proper sense. The same argument applies to animals. You know, what does it mean to bring an animal in the gallery space? So the biological problematics, of course, have to do with humidity, parasites, you know, anything that can live in the soil of plants, especially, is a serious problem to museums. There's an exhibition, an installation by Helio Oiticica that's very famous, called Tropicalia, which involved many potted plants and 2 live parrots. And museums have always faced major challenges. The pots have to be screened, the soil has to be absolutely purified and cleaned of any parasites that could infest the museum. So there are these limitations, and also plants are generally not very happy to live in galleries. You know, same applies to museums. So the bio presence in museums is per se, I think, a massive challenge. But the one that I think I am concerned with more is this tendency to now bring the living plant in the gallery space as a point of encounter that might be better than representation. When, of course, in the very moment we bring the living plant in the gallery space, it kind of becomes a painting, it kind of becomes a sculpture. It falls victim, and I talk about this towards the end of Why Look at Plants, it falls victim of the semantic powers of the gallery space, because it's how we enter the gallery space that presets our concerns with the exhibit. And in that case, we really have to think out of the box, accept the limitations, and explore new avenues all the time. That's also why I think an online exhibition is no less relevant in this context, because the real encounter with a plant, and when I say real, that's complicated in itself, right? But the unmediated encounter with the plant, if you like, it's probably better experienced out there in the woods, in a forest, in a garden, or, and even then, what is unmediated?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, again, you know, that's open sort of several questions. I was reminded of what you said, and so I quickly looked it up. The Gran Teatre del Liceu in Barcelona filled its 2,300 seats with plants for a June 22nd concert during the lockdown, which was just completely bizarre, but quite a lovely sort of, you know, intervention. And we are at our end, of course, an online exhibition, but even otherwise, because we are a non-collections based institution, we can, do such things as not worry too much about, bringing things in that might, affect a collection, and conservation practices to quite the extent as, a conventional museum would have to simply worry about. But it also opens up other questions about, where have plants, in a sense, been brought in, and then, as you say, mediated, right? And if you look at the Japanese practice of bonsai, it's a fascinating world in itself, right? Like to explore. But before I go on to ask my own questions and get carried away again, the next question.
Wait, before we move on.
Oh yes, please.
No, just one thing that Giovanni said in your conversation about how difficult it is to bring plants into the gallery space, and the way that shock of seeing them there makes them almost symbolic. It's interesting to me because it tied into seed banks in that, bringing plants, bringing the materials of the seeds themselves is a super challenge for the same exact reason that there are all these, quarantine rooms that they go through to make sure, they're quarantined, they are slowly, adjusted to temperature and humidity. All those things that are the same issue with the museum are issues in a seed bank. So I just wanted to, make that connection before we moved on.
Not at all. I should have asked you. No, that's actually that's absolutely, again, an incredible connection, because in a way the reason why bringing a live plant into a museum is a problem is precisely the circumstance that's required to preserve the seeds in a seed bank. So the next question we have is from Purav, who says, what would you say is a way to look at plants in a non-anthropocentric way, if at all? Would you say it's even possible?
No, that is the biggest challenge we're facing. I think it's always possible to try to escape or try to remove ourselves from anthropocentric registers, but ultimately it's us thinking about them. And I think language is key here. If you think about the way in which we articulate the world around us, in which we construct the world around us through language, there is really a level that there is a barrier between us and everything else. The symbolic idea that Dornith just brought in, the idea that we were discussing earlier, that once you put the plant in a gallery space, it becomes like a painting, like a sculpture. It's invested immediately in symbolism, is always there. And that's entirely in our heads. There are no symbols out there. And trying to undo the way in which we've been miseducated, to always think through metaphors, think through symbols, is one of the biggest accomplishments we could get near by becoming aware of anthropocentrism and how anthropocentrism defines our thinking. But we will not necessarily be able to escape anthropocentrism. There are ways in which we can de-objectify plants in the representation. There are ways in which plants can be presented in the gallery space that is less objectifying and that escape the tradition of symbolism and metaphor, which have been the tools through which we have objectified them over time. But ultimately, we'll still be operating in an anthropocentric dimension. I mean, we can argue that art is anthropocentric as a construct itself. One of the questions that's irritated me over time when it comes to animals as being, can animals make art? And there's quite a lot of unnecessary dilly-dallying around the answer. And my answer has always been a negative one, not because animals are inferior to us and cannot make art. It's just that they don't care, because art is a human construct. Art is not just paint on a surface. Art is business. Art is an undertaking involving very human concerns, and animals cannot share those concerns. So an animal, an elephant with a brush in its trunk playing with paint is not art, because the elephant doesn't have any understanding of being an artist and wanting to exhibit the work in a gallery. That is what entails art. Art is a network of activities, right? So in a sense, whenever we bring plants or animals into art, we already are taking them into a territory that it's anthropocentric. So I just care, just to kind of wrap it up quickly, it's about degrees of removal from anthropocentrism, not leaving it all behind.
Yes.
Thank you. I would agree with Giovanni on that, and also make the point that the idea of separating plants out from their ecosystem to look at plants separately is in itself super, super human-centered. You know, that you can't really escape it if you're saying, can we just look at plants without an anthropocentric point of view? It's separating them out from their system, which is kind of how we categorize and think about plants in the first place.
Absolutely. And to your point, Dornith, I think your work also inserts itself in a very complex place in that conversation, because you work with the rationalization of nature, with the managing, with the categorizing. I mean, your work is so entrenched in a thoroughly anthropocentric. We're going back to the idea of resource. One of the main reasons why these seed banks exist, it's because of us, because we want to make sure that one day when things really go, you know, downhill, there'll be a chance to bring back this variety or that variety. And your images, however, I feel are less anthropocentric, or try to kind of balance out that idea, because when you start focusing on seeds, for instance, seeds, as we said in our discussion, is what we sometimes can't even see with the naked eye, can't even appreciate. The way in which you manipulate the images so that they transcend the reality, that the optical reality, is a way to try and kind of reimagine seeds as they could be seen by other entities, not just by our eyes. You know, so there are levels of the work that, to me, establish an interesting dialogue with what it means to look at seeds and look at nature in itself from an anthropocentric perspective, but also less so.
Thank you.
Dornith, may I ask you to tell us a little more about the collections practices of the various seed banks that you encountered? So in a way, you know, are they similar? Are they different? Where do they differ? How do they differ? How do they take decisions? Do they get rid of things? Do they keep them all the time? I'd love to know more about the collections practices.
Well, they do have different philosophies that are somewhat influenced by not only resources, but their particular philosophical and historical backgrounds. So I find that part, the cultural aspect of seed banking decisions, is very, very interesting. And from a scientific perspective, there is a difference between having really broad and shallow collections versus very deep and narrow collections. And for instance, the UK, the Millennium Seed Bank is trying to collect a sample of every plant in the UK that is possible to preserve. And the US has a different strategy, which is much more so, they are collecting wild species as well, but their focus is, you know, food and economic security. And it's in fact managed by our National Security Administration. But the underneath it is this notion of we're going to collect as broad, as rich a collection as possible around a certain topic, around corn, for instance. They have just every kind of corn you can possibly imagine, back to teosinte, which is the ancestor of corn they collected in the wild. So that really, those practices vary quite a bit. There seems to be an emerging agreement that 5,000 seeds collected from a diverse location is enough to preserve a species. So that you don't want to take 5,000 seeds all from the same spot. And I also want to, I think I said this in the talk, but I want to caution people from collecting seeds of rare plants in the wild, because if it's not done properly, you remove its ability to reproduce in the wild. So so please don't try to help out by collecting rare seeds.
Okay.
I mean, really, like,
yeah.
And then, but what happens is it can make it go extinct in the wild. So.
Yeah. Was there any collection decision or policy that sort of surprised you? Or was there anything quirky that you observed anywhere in your journeys across the world?
Oh, they're all quirky. I mean, just, it's amazing the amount of surprising stories that I would hear. And, I think that one of the thing that we haven't really gotten into is the notion of cloning plants. And, again, in Giovanni's book, he made this really beautiful, I can't remember under which chapter it was. You were talking about how plants are unique, not unique, but one of the interesting things is how their life, what living is, and how you can break off a piece and it will start a new plant, right? That, like, if we cut off our limb, that might make us die, but we're certainly not going to grow a second set of ourselves from that. And so much of our food right now that we eat is preserved as either live collections or clones, which makes them very narrow gene pools. But also, we do it because the offspring of the plants don't retain the characteristics of the parent plants, so that citrus fruit won't grow, another exact type of orange, or apples, but also our nut fruits and stone fruits, so that they are kept in these, the US has a huge facility that's filled with liquid nitrogen holding tanks and little tiny meristems the size of poppy seeds that grow a whole plant. And so that part, I think, is a really interesting, while we're talking about biodiversity, we're also preserving these super narrow gene pools that are these very special plants that we've decided are really perfect. At the same time that they continue to try to, create cultivars that produce new types. I met a really wonderful expert in pecans, which is a type of nut native to the US that is very popular in the South. And, he devoted his whole life to breeding new, really good versions of that. And he has a live collection that they went forth with all the missionaries. So there's pecan groves all over the world that started in the US, and they went out with missionaries, and he went and collected and then brought them back. And has been crossbreeding those to try to make, and he spent his whole life, and I think he's made 7 new types. But to spend your life crossbreeding continuously in an effort to improve a crop and find 7, it's just such an interesting idea about the effort involved in our food supply that we don't even think about when we get paper shell pecans or little native pecans, because I'm from Texas.
Right. Pecan pie, I remember that.
So I would say that that's a really kind of quirky aspect of seed banking that I had really never given thought to, is the fact that we have giant cryogenic preservation just for trees, or kept as poppy seeds.
Giovanni, may I ask you to, in a few words, share with our audiences what critical plant studies is?
Sure. It's a very fascinating field of inquiry, academic field of inquiry, that developed roughly around 2013, 2014. So it's still relatively young. And one of the most famous, one of the most well-known exponents of critical plant studies is Michael Marter, who has brought plants into the discourses of philosophy, you know, like Western philosophy has marginalized animals and of course marginalized plants. So he's done incredible work about plants and how we can reconsider their presence in our thinking and also in our being, which is very important. And critical plant studies is also connected to animal studies. Many colleagues I know from animal studies migrated into plant studies, wanting to work with something more radical, no pun intended. But you know, the alterity of plants, in a sense, enables certain discourses to happen that animal studies couldn't quite allow. Animals are, you know, incredibly diverse, and so are plants. But there's something about the biology of plants that perhaps is a little bit more kind of compressed and sane. And it's a field that it's extremely relevant right now. So it's growing, as obviously your exhibition as well is connected to the theories behind it, and hopefully will continue to grow.
Thank you. I would like to now take the opportunity to thank you both for your time, for the talk, the discussion between yourselves, but also with me and the audience, and sharing your thoughts. I think what we saw, at least to my mind, was a coming together of a fascinating array of knowledge and learning. There's Dornith's artistic work, but her deep study of the practices of seed bank scientists and the banking practices and the locations, the incredible, of course, expedition and the experiences of traveling to these places, and, you know, which has never been separate from doing scientific research, right? If you look into the history of science, you find that, you know, being a part of that adventure is also what brings science alive when you share that knowledge with people. So I want to thank you both for your generosity in sharing your work, your time, and just bringing, you know, everything from philosophy to cultural studies to art history to artistic practice to scientific research in one single discussion, and the sort of wonderful collegiality with which the two of you interacted, not only between yourselves but with us. So thank you again for joining us this evening. And to our audiences, I trust you will be just as impressed with the discussion and fascinated by the kind of things that Dornith and Giovanni have shared with us. Do please share your feedback with us so that we learn more and we interact more with you, and also better ourselves as we move forward. So thanks again to everyone, and thanks to our audiences for joining us on a Sunday evening, and good night.
Bye-bye. Thank you.